Folks, we've got Amanda Yee and Jorge Roca joining us. Very happy to have you. You're both returning guests, but never been on at the same time. Really happy to have both of you on today. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be on again.
Yeah.
Great stream. I always try to catch it whenever I can. I like having it on in the background when I'm doing work,
Oh,
which I think
good.
I told you like
Yeah.
last time I came on.
No,
Yeah.
I love that. Um.
Yeah,
Well, listen.
real quick, Rob.
Yeah.
It's pronounced Rocha, not Rocha.
Rocha. Okay.
All right,
Jorge
go.
Rocha. Okay, I was trying to like. Okay, no good. Thank you for correcting me on that, so I don't continue
Oh, of
sounding
course. It's an
sounding
unusual
silly.
pronunciation. It's not actually Spanish. It's Portuguese.
Mm.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Um. Well, bit of a mea culpa. I was super busy this morning, and I didn't have a ton of time to actually like write down questions or bullet points, which I normally like to do. However, I talk about this stuff all the time. I know you two talk about this stuff all the time, and we're often always talking ourselves about this kind of stuff. We're talking about the new Cold War, the new Red Scare, foreign policy stuff. So I feel confident that we can have just a conversation about the things that you two are working on and what's going on with geopolitically right now. I feel pretty good about. We're also, this is a little behind the curtain kind of stuff. We're part of a very powerful and influential China DM, which we've bonded over our unflinching support for the People's Republic of China. So we can just bring some of those conversations to the people of Twitch.
Yeah, I will say that it's not as serious as it sounds. It's a Twitter DM, and yeah, sometimes we talk about, foreign policy and stuff like that. But like 90% of the time, it's just like us sharing memes back and forth and like making fun of other people on
Yeah,
Twitter.
our
And,
enemies.
sometimes it's
Yeah,
like tangentially China related.
yeah, yeah.
Group
Well,
chat.
I think like I think the best way to like get the conversation started with you two, and I know Jorge, like I want to talk about your campaign in DSA right now and DSA International Committee, but this is really related to that because I think like, and this going when you learn about the Cold War, the previous Cold War, and how the left in the West has kind of gone along over the last couple of decades, you realize that this split is like not a really new thing, but you realize how I think when you talk about the Western left, how there's really like a split around the issue of imperialism and foreign policy. And I think maybe, in the Trump years, that was obscured a little bit. It felt a little bit like the sort of internationalist left. I'm not just talking about America or Canada or whatever, but like anyone that's like living in the heart of the empire. Um, it seemed like there was maybe more of a sense of unity around the idea of what it means to be on the left or what it means to be a socialist or whatever. And this kind of contradiction has really come to the forefront, especially over the last year and a half with the Russia Ukraine conflict, and you see this really big split. And you could argue that like going back to 2018 and China and Hong Kong and a lot of the accusations about human rights in China as well were kind of opening salvo in this as well. But I'm just wondering, like after the last year and a half of you two, for you two, and the work that you've been doing, Amanda, I know you do a lot of work with the PSL. Jorge, you're part of the DSA International Committee. I guess just like I'm wondering what your feelings are about this issue and this contradiction, and how the left needs to be like more unified moving forward on the subject of foreign policy and imperialism, and what's holding the movement back from that kind of unity.
Who wants to start?
Big questions.
Um,
You want to go, Amanda?
I mean, I can go either way. You can go first if you want to.
Sure. So, yeah, I think there's absolutely. So when I applied, so when you run for NPC, you have to apply and do a whole rigmarole in terms of process within DSA. For those who don't know, NPC stands for National Political Committee, which is the highest leadership body within DSA. And those who are candidates, like myself, we run a campaign, and then depending on all the delegates that get at the national convention, which is in August. So basically, the way DSA works, because DSA is so large, at the national convention, people must elect representatives known as delegates to represent all the different chapters around the organization to convene at. And this year, this could be in August in Chicago, and about 1,200 plus delegates, which is quite a good amount. But it's we're talking about tens of thousands of members here. So then, among those delegates, they're the ones who decide and vote on who will be representing the leadership of the entire organization in the National Political Committee. And I'm going to be one of the candidates. But when I applied, and one of the questions that was asked is like, what do you think is a priority for DSA in the next few years? And I think DSA has done an incredible job with electoral campaign. I think I'm despite having the politics that I do, I'm a constant defender of its electoral campaign, mostly because I think it's partially, a lot of it's like, if you're worried about electeds, it's important to focus on they're a very small group of people, whether federal, whether state, whether city, and you just got to let it play out a bit longer for there to be more power built both inside and outside the capitalist state. And also same thing with like labor campaigns, same thing with like pressure campaigns. But something I thought that really need to be emphasized that is not currently emphasized at a national level is the fact that we must be opposed to a Cold War against China, period. And this is the position that the International Committee holds, that one of our campaigns is that we want there to not be a Cold War against China. Rob alluded to earlier in terms of like, say, some of my opinions regarding the People's Republic of China in terms of whether or not it's socialist, whether or not it's worth defending. That I think is relevant in terms of what I think DSA should do. I do believe there is a consensus with respect to, or at least I would hope so, there will be consensus on the fact that if you put the question of whether China is socialist or not, just hold that there, put it to the side. What does matter is that we cannot allow for an imperialist project of trying to instigate another Cold War against the largest population in the world. And depending on your definition of like economics, in terms of some definition of GDP, China is the largest, but realistically in terms of purchasing power is still the second largest economy in the world. And with respect to things like climate change, we as a global community need to be working together to actually make a just transition to clean energy. Otherwise, we're doomed. So I think I strongly believe that needs to happen.
Yeah, I'll just say that, like, myself and my comrades, we've always believed that, and we've always held this line that any kind of like war posturing or like aggression toward China by the US government has led and will always lead to, it'll always turn inward toward the Chinese citizens living in the US. And, like that's proven itself true over the past few years, right? Not only have we had COVID, not only has COVID or like the rhetoric around COVID and like China's supposed role in COVID led to assaults and attacks on Chinese people within the past few years. But this like escalating Cold War has also led to the prosecution of Chinese Americans in the US. And this really escalated. This really started under Trump. But Biden has exacerbated it even further, and what's really kind of depressing about McCarthyism is that, it's really easy for people to condemn it 50, 60 years after the fact. But when it's happening right before our very eyes, we see that a lot of people, including people on the left, will jump right on the bandwagon. And that's exactly what's happening right now. We are seeing a new era of McCarthyism as we speak. And I think it's really appropriate because the first wave of McCarthyism, like in the 1950s, that was launched by the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And it was launched by the so-called loss of China, right? McCarthyism officially like launched in February of 1950, when McCarthy kind of he gave his what is now known as the Loss of China speech. And this speech accused the State Department of harboring secret communist agents. And he said in this speech, in my opinion, the State Department, which is one of the most important government departments, is thoroughly infested with communists. I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy. One thing to remember in discussing the communists in our government is that we are not dealing with spies who get 30 pieces of silver to steal the blueprints of new weapons. We are dealing with a far more sinister type of activity because it permits the enemy to guide and shape our policy. Now, a few years ago, starting a few years ago, what the government has been using to indict and prosecute people with like supposed ties to the Chinese government is what's known as the Foreign Agent Relations Act. And this is an act that was for a really long time kind of this obscure legislation, which kind of required any sort of lobbyist or any sort of advocate on the behalf of a foreign government to register with the Department of Justice. And for a long time, most lobbyists saw it as a law to be skirted because it was never really enforced, and the DOJ never really enforced it. So a lot of lobbyists decided not to fill out like the paperwork to register under FARA. But that all changed when Robert Mueller kind of launched the Russia investigation, right? And he charged 2 officials in the Trump administration, like prosecuted them under FARA. And, ever since then, Trump started using FARA to go after people who supposedly had ties to the Chinese Communist Party or the Communist Party of China, right? And this really produced an atmosphere of paranoia and fear among Asian American citizens. Like one of the things that he did in 2020 was that Trump signed an executive order canceling the visas of thousands of Chinese graduate students and researchers who had ties to universities affiliated with the People's Liberation Army. And Biden has continued this policy, continuing to deny visas to Chinese grad students based on the Chinese universities that they attend. And one really interesting thing about that is that what the government uses to determine a level of risk of a Chinese university that student is associated with is what's called the China Defense Universities Tracker, which is an online tracker put out by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, as I'm sure like a lot of your viewers know already, is an Australian think tank that was one of the primary purveyors of the Uyghur genocide narrative, right? And they were one of the first ones to really like put that myth into circulation and really pushed it. And ASPI, of course, is funded by the Australian Defense Department, along with military contractors like Boeing Australia and Lockheed Martin, who donate like hundreds of thousands of dollars to this think tank. And, they have their own like vested in financial interest in, military aggression against China. So, Trump, Trump really escalated this trade war with China. And then like along with that, he started persecuting Chinese American citizens. And Biden has only continued that. We see him invoking FARA in the case of, we see the DOJ invoking FARA in the case of like Henry Liang, who is a hotel union worker in Boston, who is a Chinese American activist, who, his only crime was promoting peaceful relations between Taiwan and China, promoting a peaceful reunification between Taiwan and the mainland. And then, recently in New York City, two people who are running this service station in Chinatown have also been indicted under FARA. They're accused of having ties to the CPC and, like spying on Chinese American activists, like activists who speak out against China. And they're ahead of this like service organization in Chinatown, which provides services to Chinese immigrants who speak like very limited English, and they help them process paperwork and IDs and stuff like that.
These are those secret CPC police stations.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's these secret CPC stations. How people came to know about them was, they were all put into this report by this, NGO. I forget what they're called. But I'm sure they have like some sort of dark funding. I don't know. But
it's safe to
it's a
assume
really
that they
dangerous
do.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, and like what you're pointing out too, it's worth mentioning as well that this is not at all limited to the United States. This kind of McCarthyism, we're getting all kinds of wild accusations being made in Canada against both politicians and members of parliament that have Chinese origins, or against people like in the Chinese diaspora in Canada, and it's very strange and alarming and kind of sinister the way that this is happening, where you have basically CSIS, the Canadian spy agency, is making these kinds of accusations about MPs and about people in the diaspora community, and it just gets completely laundered through their assets in Canadian media and basically just gets reprinted as a press release, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Accusing China of having some kind of like undergoing some kind of effort to influence the Canadian government. Like the CPC is really like deeply implicated in these random like liberal backbenchers in the Canadian Parliament. Or I think the really more alarming thing, like similar to what you're describing, Amanda, is that there's this kind of climate that's being propagated right now when it comes to Chinese Canadians or Chinese Americans, which ultimately applies to pretty much anyone from with a sort of Asian background, like living in the West, where basically they're being really pressured through these campaigns to fall in line on the kind of thinking about China, which is that we need to hold it accountable for these human rights violations, and they're spying on us and they're influencing our politics. And anytime anyone that's part of this diaspora speaks out against that and says, well, like, hold on, maybe we shouldn't just be so quick to immediately accept these accusations about human rights coming from think tanks like ASPI or things like that. Or, maybe we should be like learning from the China's accomplishments over the last couple of decades with the incredible infrastructure projects or things like that. And basically, like, there's this climate that's being that's kind of in effect right now, where that kind of viewpoint, anyone that's from that community who espouses that viewpoint, is automatically now suspect and is automatically accused of like basically being influenced by or controlled by the CPC or sorry, the CCP. I get confused about which is the good acronym and the bad acronym.
Yeah, I do too.
Because I say CPC ironically sometimes because it upsets people so much. But this climate is really dangerous. This idea that like if you're part of this diasporic community in Canada or the United States, you're basically not allowed to speak out in defense of the place where you have these familial ties. You're not really able to like promote this idea that we should have more diplomatic or cultural ties, or that it's basically, if anyone espouses these views, you're accused of basically being a foreign agent or a spy, or being controlled or manipulated or brainwashed by the CPC, and that's a really dangerous climate. And I think that's something that's like, it's really easy to see how quickly that can really get a lot more dangerous for people in this community. And that's why I think it's really important that people speak out about that and recognize what's going on. But a lot of people seem really reluctant to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's CPC because it's Communist Party of, and then
yeah,
after. But I think it really is like really unfortunate in terms of how everything plays out, but it for those who are watching, like either live or later, we must remember this is not just, oh, the United States government it just hates China or they're racist against Chinese people. I think it's we have to remember this is a much longer, much larger project of imperialism. And if you try to remember that that is what is occurring, which is fundamentally the United States as an entity and its ruling class, probably at least 130, 40 years ago. I'm not sure whenever, I think it was 130 years ago, whenever the Spanish American War happened, there was a decision that because there was no more destiny to manifest within its own borders in terms of it went from sea to shining sea, which is like if you're someone who's indigenous, that should not be viewed as like something with pride, but rather it's like a threat. It's a rallying cry for ethnic cleansing, for genocide, in terms of like we're gonna clear out every single place land of, despite us being settler colonialists coming onto this land that already has people on it, that we're gonna go from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Once that occurred, once that was already happened, like by the mid to late 19th century, the ruling class of this country said, okay, well, we want the line to keep going up. We want more money. We want more profit. We want more resources, more control. Then, therefore, it starts expanding beyond that in terms of, like I said, the Spanish-American War with regards to the Philippines, regarding Cuba, but also with Hawaii and Alaska, and continued moving forward. And this is why the United States, as well as other countries in Europe, and it's important to consider the United States as a continuation of European settler colonialism, that other countries like the United Kingdom, like France, like and all the other countries in Europe who were complicit in the colonization of China with respect to the Opium Wars, and ever since, and as Amanda greatly mentioned, it's like ever since China and its people said in 1949 and defended itself in the sense of like, no, we're a sovereign nation, we're our own society, and we're going to determine what direction we want to go because we are who we are, and we deserve to, and we are people who live on this land, and we deserve and have the right to decide what destiny we want to go forward. And ever since then, capitalist West has never forgiven China. People point to say the Deng reforms, right? And in terms of like, oh, well, this is a proof that the Communist Party of China, when is a revisionist or doesn't care about socialism or became capitalist, regardless if like you think that's true or not, that doesn't matter in terms of what we're talking about here, because the global community that we live in, we are so interconnected in terms of economically, but also there are things that we remember because of this recent conflict in Ukraine, but we must remember that there is a thing called nuclear weapons that we cannot allow for there to be any kind of escalation. It's like people say, oh, well, do you think that nuclear weapons is like a trump card? It's like, no, this is literally true. Like this nuclear weapons is a existential threat to humanity. If there's any kind of nuclear escalation, that there's a nuclear standoff or exchange, then it just becomes there is no end in sight, and most people will die. And there's not like a trying to be doomer about it, but these are the stakes here. And there are also other things in terms of why we must do everything we can in terms of trying to prevent this. There are other aspects in the world with regards, like for example, COVID. Could you imagine if we lived in a world where, say, COVID-19 as a virus, which as far as we know, came organically from, I forget the exact term, but spill over from an animal, in terms of used to be a virus that was in a specific animal species and spilled over to humans.
Zoonotic, yeah.
Zoonotic. So everything we know about this is that it just organically happened in terms of like, this is like this, like avian flu or swine flu. This is not something unusual. This has happened many times before. That could you imagine if we lived in a world where was cooperation with respect to things that will continue to organically happen because viruses are just the fact of the world we live in. I worry about, say, if something much more deadly than, say, COVID-19 manifests itself, that we will not be able to work together. And this is something that, we must be we must have on our minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit on Jorge's earlier point about the history of the U.S. And the history of the U.S. as, this imperialist, settler, colonialist nation. I don't think that it's coincidental right now that there is this like fear mongering over China and China's economic rise. And at the same time, there is a movement associated with Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley, Matt Gaetz, that is attempting to galvanize the white working class base around this program of national rejuvenation. And, that program, it's called America First. It has like a long history. It dates back to the early 20th century, but they always have, like it was pretty much standard orthodoxy within the Republican Party up until the beginning of the Cold War.
Yeah. And just to cut you off for a brief moment, there's a lot of people that self-identify as like leftists or socialists or communists or whatever that are lecturing us about how this is something that everyone should be supporting and how they're the real anti-imperialists and all this kind of stuff, which is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it's not new. It saw a resurgence with the election of Trump in 2016, but it's always had the same features historically. They were viciously anti-immigration. They had an anti-foreign intervention foreign policy. And they also had like a really vicious program of austerity, like elimination of the welfare state and cutting of like public services, right? And it's always had like a fascist or semi-fascist political character. And what's so dangerous about this movement gaining steam right now, where we're in this period of economic decline, we're in a period of capitalist crisis, is that these fascists, these America First isolationists, they recognize the same symptoms of capitalism in crisis as socialists do, right? We recognize the same symptoms of capitalism in crisis, which is mass poverty, mass homelessness, mass unemployment. But these fascists, right, they shift the blame onto an internal or external enemy. So they shift the blame onto immigrants in the US, or they shift the blame onto an external enemy, which in this case is China. Back then it was the Soviet Union. Whereas socialists, they blame the structure of capitalism itself. They see mass unemployment and poverty, homelessness, they see these as key features of capitalism. So what's so dangerous is that these fascists, they redirect that discontent into strengthening support for the capitalist system, which is what produces these symptoms to begin with. And they redirect that discontent into an ultra-nationalist, pro-imperialist program. And, fascism emerges when there's an economic crisis, but also an ideological crisis, where there's a crisis of political legitimacy within the government, which is happening right now, right? The ruling class is losing its political legitimacy. And at the same time, there's a rising superpower that presents an alternative. During the Cold War, the first one, it was the Soviet Union. Now it's China. And so this is why, you talk about these people who are supposedly on the left, Rob, who think that, we can make temporary alliances with these America First isolationists. That's why it's not a great idea. It's a terrible idea. We can't align ourselves with this movement because this movement has always had a fascist political character to it. And it really speaks to the urgency of building like a real left-wing alternative.
Yeah. And I think one thing as well that like has contributed to this is over the last year and a half, especially, there's been basically zero effort from anyone that's part of this sort of mainstream Democratic Party left, like even the most progressive parts of that. They've all been 100% on board with this nonstop flow of arms to Ukraine, to propagate this ongoing proxy war there. Even when the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party like thought about sending it, like they sent a fucking letter to be like, hey, maybe can we encourage some kind of negotiation or dialogue, and they were shouted down basically by all these people online and the really deranged people, and they pulled back from that. And I think that's one of the unfortunate consequences of that, the total abdication of responsibility of anyone to take a tough stance, because I recognize that it's a difficult line to walk, but no one in the kind of mainstream movement has been willing to do that. And then that's opened up this door for the Tucker Carlsons of the world or the MTGs or Josh Hawleys or whoever. And that doesn't mean I think that people should believe those people. I don't think we should take reactionaries at face value when they make these kind of critiques about the military or imperialism. I think often of like the 2000 presidential election and George W. Bush, and he was talking about it. He's against nation building and he's against this kind of adventurism, and how if the discourse from today was going on then, we'd have all these like patriotic socialists telling us why you need to support George W. Bush, and we all remember exactly what happened. Like, I don't think we should just take these people at face value when they make these kind of critiques, but it does really speak to this total refusal by anyone that's involved anywhere near the sort of mainstream of the Democratic Party or the sort of liberal connected to the liberal establishment to make these kind of criticisms or to advocate a different approach. It's really empowered and opened up the door for these kinds of reactionaries, these America First reactionaries, to make these kind of arguments. And you see that's like they are effective arguments that have, and there's people that are willing to listen to them, especially like whether they're in the political world or just people that have seen their material conditions deteriorate. They see the nonstop flow of arms to places like Ukraine and the way that the government is just has this ongoing like money printer basically sending arms and supplies to Ukraine. And that becomes an effective argument when people say like, look, at your life's getting worse, and like, look what the government's doing and what the Biden administration is doing and the Democratic Party's doing. I can see why, that becomes appealing for people, but that's exactly why there needs to be an alternative to that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is deeply worrying kind of what we're seeing, where there is a fervor for war in both parties.
Mm-hmm.
But the disagreement is whether on who it should be against. The
Right.
reason like Republicans are against the war and sending weapons to Ukraine has nothing to do whether or not they actually care about Ukrainians, has nothing to do whether or not they believe in terms of something regarding NATO. No, they don't care. They're like any Republican, any conservative, any fucking fascist that talks about NATO, they're totally, completely, and utterly being opportunists, trying to get kind of like what we're just talking about, to that yes, there is truth to the fact that yes, NATO is an imperialist project. Yes, NATO is trying to how do we say it? Enclose, like encircle,
Encircle, yeah.
and encircle Russia. This is definitely true in terms of like the way NATO has kind of progressed over time. In my opinion, I don't think this is excuses in terms of what Russia has done. This is a position of the International Committee that we condemn both going on. That being said, I think it's important to contextualize why is it that like conservatives are mentioning NATO in this way, and it's because they're trying to galvanize those that are recognizing the war as a proxy war for what it is. But the disagreement is like, well, the problem isn't that NATO does wars. The problem is NATO should do a war against China. And that's kind of been the case for a while now, where it's like Democrats kind of and Republicans kind of flip back and forth in terms of their foreign policy with respect to which enemy nations are we going to focus on. And Democrats love to focus on Russia, whereas Republicans love to focus on China and Iran too. So I think it's I saw an article recently. I forget where I saw it, but it may have been the New York Times, but I don't quote me on that, but there's an article that says America's enemies are uniting. And I think this kind of goes to show where it's like, well, there's some truth to that, but it goes to show that that has a lot more to do with the fact that the reasons countries like Iran and Russia and China or Venezuela overall on its face really don't have much in common in terms of like the way their governments are structured or their political economy or even their long-term interests. Like countries like Iran and Russia, for sure, the conservative right-wing nationalist governments. Iran is a theocracy, but the reason they're, uniting, quote unquote, is because the United States kind of pushed them in that direction, in a sense that if you lump a bunch of people together and continually oppose them, well, what do you think is going to happen? And it's almost comical in a sense of like how poor of a job the United States had done in terms of trying to unite its enemies against itself.
Yeah. Like both the Republicans and the Democrats, for the most part, are for both a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia or for a war with China. It's just like, it's just a matter of like, who should they prioritize containing first, right? Should they prioritize this proxy war with China, or should they prioritize, like a full-on military confrontation with China? And like even, Republicans are for a proxy war with Russia. It's just that there's like this like kind of political trend that's happening right now. This like ideological realignment within the Republican Party, where we're seeing this resurgence of America First isolationists who are supposedly against U.S. involvement in this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And a lot of people mistake the fact that they are against it. They mistake it for a position of being anti-war, but they're not anti-war, because if you read their policy proposals, if you read their public statements, their rhetoric is very aggressive toward China. Like if you read Marjorie Taylor Greene's America First Caucus policy platform, it says explicitly that we need to be prepared to confront China militarily. And Josh Hawley has like publicly stated that we should not be sending weapons to Ukraine because, in their view, it's draining resources which should be used to arm Taiwan. So it's not, this is like where people, I think, get a little bit tripped up. They are not anti-war. They are not anti-military spending. They are anti-military spending when it comes to NATO, because they believe that NATO and this proxy war in Ukraine is a huge U.S. wealth transfer to Europe, and that we are fighting Europe's wars for them, when we should be, using all those resources toward what they see as the real threat, which is China.
Yeah. I mean, you get the sense that some of these these are reactionaries or America First types, like actually correctly realize that this Russia-China bloc, which has been kind of like pushed together after being separate for many decades, has been pushed back together by U.S. imperialism and by Western sort of belligerence. And they recognize that like that's a pretty powerful bloc that America's going to have a difficult time defeating if they are together. And perhaps it would be best for American imperialist strategy to try and cause a kind of rupture or split again and bring Russia kind of back into their camp, which is probably, it's far too late for that. But I think that might be part of the strategy or the thinking as well. And it's funny too, because you'd think this whole idea of the whole America First nationalists being kind of anti-imperialist or anti-war, you'd think that would have died with the Trump administration when Trump campaigned on this kind of thing. but when was actually in office, did not, like people say, like, oh, he didn't start any new wars, as if that's supposed to be this prove that he's this kind of anti-war figure. But he's bombing Syria. He continued to arm and fund Ukraine during that time, which led directly to the outbreak of the conflict in 2022. He assassinated Soleimani in Iran, which very nearly kicked off fucking World War III there. You know what I mean? You'd think this idea would have died when he got into office after campaigning on this kind of platform and did not engage with the world or pull back in any way, withdraw in any way from America's role in the rest of the world. But people are still holding on to this idea that Trump and his kind of acolytes in the Republican Party are these anti-war figures, which there's no evidence to remotely suggest this.
Yeah, that's a really common argument that I see a lot. And it really blows my mind that this argument that Trump is like a genuine anti-war or anti-imperialist president, because the only way that you can see him as such is if you ignore the entirety of his foreign policy record, right? He almost got us into a war with Iran by ordering the assassination of Soleimani, as you said. And it was only through the restraint of Iran that we, didn't end up in a war with them, which would have been disastrous. But I mean, yeah, he also escalated a lot of the drone wars that Obama started in places like Syria, Somalia, I think.
Yeah.
And then, he also escalated a lot of the sanctions and deepened the economic warfare on places where the U.S. was already sanctioning, like Venezuela and Cuba.
Or restarted the sanctions against Iran after the Iran deal.
And honestly, like, sanctions are really, it's 2023, right? Sanctions are really the weapon of choice in terms of warfare now. Like, now we do this kind of economic warfare because the killing is much more silent, right? There's not like the drama of, bombing. We're killing people in a much quieter way through starvation and denial of medicine and disrupting food supplies.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention too, with what you're just with everything you said, Amanda, is like not only that, but under the Trump administration, there were multiple coup attempts that happened. Mm-hmm. Now, one could argue, well, that we don't know the full story. Completely agree, but I think it does goes to show that there were these coup attempts that happened in Latin America. One in Venezuela, which we all laugh about it because of how ridiculously terrible it was done, but it is, we have to take that very seriously. I mean, people of Venezuela did not think it was a laughing matter. They thought it was like a very serious attempt in trying to overthrow their government and their the democratic elected government. But also in Bolivia, there was a coup. It wasn't even a coup attempt. There was a coup. It's just that the organized working class of Bolivia were so militant and so disciplined and so organized that they managed to break the curse that's happened in Latin America regarding socialism, and they managed to basically get back into power after there was a coup. And I think we have to recognize that beyond that, he's just like a fearless president. He's a person who is unhinged and reckless and willing to try to go deepen the damage that the United States has done throughout the rest of the world.
Yeah, and so, talking about Venezuela as well, I think one of the another moment for Trump as well during that whole process was bringing in Elliot Abrams, this classic Cold Warrior who oversaw and covered up these genocides and horrific crimes during the Cold War in the 80s, and brought him back to oversee this Venezuela operation, which really made it really nakedly obvious to everyone exactly what was going on. And now, you have Joe Biden bringing Elliot Abrams in again to show the complete crossover and continuity between both parties in the U.S. when it comes to their foreign policy goals, which is pretty incredible in and of itself too.
Recurring character of imperialism.
Yeah.
Just when you think that Elliot Abrams is not coming back, guess what, folks? He's coming back. Yeah. Elliot Abrams really likes the International Committee, actually. There's a wonderful article. I would recommend everyone to read it that he published on the Council on Foreign Relations blog, talking about how the DSA is like a supporter of dictators and what have you, because we sent a delegation to Venezuela and people met Maduro. He really loves DSA.
Well, I mean, that's a good way to talk a little bit about the work that the International Committee is doing. And, I was talking about the way that, like, the issue of foreign policy and imperialism is something that should be, like, a unifying thing in the left. But when you look at, like, the International Committee and the response to it, not from conservatives or liberals, but from people, like, on the left or people within DSA, I think it reveals that there really is this big split in the movement. Because a lot of the time I see the stances that DSA International Committee takes, and I think, yeah, that's really a principled critique. They're engaging in this kind of like internationalism or anti-imperialism, pretty cut and dry. But there's this whole like community basically of people within DSA, and maybe this is a small but vocal minority. Like I don't know how much what the numbers are, but you see there's a strong contingent, especially online, of people in the organization that really push back on these stances and view the International Committee as being some kind of like outlier that's destroying the credibility of the organization and criticizing this. So as someone from the International Committee, and by the way, Amanda, I know with PSL you get the same kind of treatment from a lot of the same people as well with stances on China or Ukraine or whatever. But Jorge, like you're running for the DSA NPC, and how is that something that you plan to like confront this kind of split or this contradiction within the organization when it comes to imperialism and foreign policy? And is that something that you think can be mended?
I think it can very easily be mended. One aspect I think is important to mention. Unfortunately, because in the United States, we don't have a practice of having democracy. We're kind of unused to what democracy looks like. And a lot of it has to do with that. When people don't agree, they're going to mention their positions. They're going to suggest what their stances are. And even if there are a vocal minority or a large opposition, they're going to broadcast those opinions. So I think those people have every right to broadcast the positions that they wish to have. I think it's very unfortunate that a lot of the discourse that DSA has happens on Twitter in a public space, but I do think a lot of it has to do with that there is no, because the organization is so large, we are learning how to kind of navigate how to have discussions as an organization. So the way that it comes about right now is Twitter. To answer your question in terms of like whether it's like a large group of people or not, I mean, this is kind of like it's a mystery for anyone. People are going to suggest that their side is going to be the majority or the minority or what have you, but I think the only way that can kind of indicate that is what is that occurs at the processes like the National Convention, but also other places. Regarding the International Committee, I mean, I think it is important to mention that the International Committee is not a rogue formation within DSA. It is a national working group of which it is subservient to the National Political Committee. Every commission, which is the formal term for all the working groups and committees at a national level for DSA, are all meant to be an aspect of, the national political leadership. This is supposed to be the highest leadership of the organization. So a lot of what we do, if there is in fact like we deeply care about trying to create consensus. This is why, say for instance, like we have the positions that we do. Like I mentioned, like people may not agree about, say, the validity of, say, whether or not, say, the Communist Party of China is a socialist party. That I think is irrelevant to say what does a socialist party in the U.S. with a large big tent of tendencies in terms of socialist tendencies within what should we do? And in my opinion, I think the primary thing that we can control is what the United States government can do in terms of like what, again, we don't have control really or power really to stop, say, sending weapons or to stop drone strike. But because we are people who live in this country, that is the most effective that we can be. And so this is why positions like no Cold War against China is something that's so focused on. But also within the international community, it's like a few hundred members. There's a lot of votes, a lot of discussion, a lot of meetings, and deep care in terms of trying to make sure that we're trying to create consensus here. So I think those who perhaps don't agree, one, I think they're just saying they don't agree. I think they have every right to have that opinion. I obviously don't agree with them, but I think where it kind of gets out of hand, in my opinion, is when, say, it goes into suggesting that there is no democratic process making within the international committee, which is a total either misunderstanding or kind of misrepresentation. And I would say that I think it is overcomable. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of members that I speak to, regarding the international committee, they are in favor of a lot of what we do because of this aspect. It's like we are trying to say, like, there's a careful balance of trying to, yes, there are like these more, quote unquote hard left or parties that are out there like Venezuela, but also we are trying, because it's a big tent organization, we do deeply care about, say, GSA in terms of a lot of the things that we're trying to push for. To be transparent, yes, we are aware a lot of the things we're trying to push for is for social democracy. Yes, we know this. Trying to tell us that doesn't change anything. We know this. We're intentionally trying to do it because we believe, at least in this moment, social democracy is the current path of which people can rally around, because people are not really at a position where a revolutionary politics makes sense. If that becomes an opening, people like myself would push for that. But currently, as it stands, like a social democratic project of reforms is like the way we can build power. That being said, the reason I mentioned that, because then it's like, well, this is also why I say we support, say, Venezuela, but also we support people like Boric or Lula. And I think it's important that we should try to talk to all the left-wing parties that are either in the strongest opposition or are in government. Why? Because we want to learn from them. We want to learn how to build power, and we want to learn how to actually, once we're in power, what that means, but also solidarity. There's an international movement.
Well, Amanda, like, what do you think about this? Like, I know one of the accusations that gets thrown around against, the DSA International Committee or against PSL is this idea of like campism. And like, oh no, we shouldn't be supporting either camp. You're getting pushed into this kind of thing where you're just, because you're anti-imperialist or you're anti-Western, you're getting pulled into this supporting this other camp. But it seems to me, when you see these forces of imperialism kind of gathering and promoting this kind of escalating Red Scare, this escalating new Cold War against China, it seems to me that like sitting on the fence and being like, no, I'm against either. I'm especially if you live in the middle of the empire in the US or Canada or whatever, I don't think that's a really helpful position. If you're a socialist, if you're an internationalist, yeah, I feel like you kind of have to pick a side on that. And then it doesn't really help anything to kind of take this holier than thou, neither Washington nor Beijing, similarly in the previous Cold War. Not that every single thing that happened in the Soviet Union was perfect or great, or that mistakes didn't happen or contradictions didn't happen, but this neither Washington nor Moscow approach then was an incoherent position and an unhelpful position then, similar to the way that kind of position is today when it comes to China.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of individuals and a lot of groups that are really committed to not wanting to decide what they say, like the US is bad, but also this other government, whether it be China, Venezuela, Cuba, also is bad and it has its faults. And what that does is it ends up like paralyzing you into this position of just like total inactivity. And you are paralyzed to not be able to do anything at all, right? And I agree 100% with Jorge's point that, like, we living in the heart of empire, it is our responsibility to push back on our government's policies against other countries, because that is what we have the most power and the most ability to do. And in order to do that, we have to build like a real mass movement, right? And that is our responsibility as people living in the belly of the beast. You know, and every time, some kind of protest erupts in, like say Cuba or Venezuela, you always see these like people who stake out this third position that isn't really helpful to anyone. And I think we all remember a few years ago during the Cuba protests when there were a lot of people, like unhappy about the way that the government had handled COVID, right? And you saw a lot of these people take that, kind of third position, which, like, what does that really help? Who does that really help?
You saw the
You
same
know,
thing with Bolivia, by the way. Jorge mentioned Bolivia. There was a
yeah,
lot of people. Oh, it's not a coup. Oh, Morales was going beyond his powers, and there's the thing with the term limits, and a lot of people downplaying this coup when it was happening, even though it was really obvious to anyone with like a basic understanding of imperialism and foreign policy that it was. But like you're saying, people were taking this third stance, saying like, well, let's not throw around these accusations of a coup right away, which
yeah.
not helpful.
In the case of Cuba, they were saying that, there were a lot of people unhappy with the way that they couldn't access certain goods and like the economic situation in Cuba, which of course is like it's a
Yeah, of course.
real feeling. But these people were like laying the blame on the governments. And people in the US who like supported these protests were also laying the blame on the government. But like, what is the primary contradiction here? It's US imperialism and the fact that the US imposes like a really devastating blockade that really prevents Cuba from accessing a lot of materials to be able to like have like a really functioning, flourishing economy. So, by taking that third position, you are really siding on the side of US imperialism because you're saying that, like you are shifting responsibility off of the US blockade and onto the Cuban government.
I do think there is like a careful balance too with respect to some of the discussion. I mean, um, obviously, I think this DSA probably takes different stances than say PSL does in terms of like. I personally don't disagree with what you're saying, Amanda, but I do think that it does warrant kind of especially trying to reach a lot of people who are not already like on board with say like what it really means to be an international socialist, and um at least in terms of what we think. So the balance, in my opinion, I think is like if because Americans are so inundated with like propaganda and they so believe that an important aspect of the concept of America, it's something I think about all the time. Like, well, what is the United States, right? What is it, right? And it's like, and it's kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like, it's a settler, colonialist, imperialist, white supremacist, like all we can go on and on. But most people, because if they were raised in this country, they are so inundated with that propaganda that once you mention, say, even like those aspects, a lot of people's brains just shut off in a sense of like they just have an emotional reaction. So I do think that we have to be mindful of trying to, how do we say it, raise people awareness of that. And
Yeah.
so it does require a careful balance, in my opinion.
And I agree with that too. And it's like that. I think that's where these kind of like, if you want to call them the patriotic socialist types, you can talk about, Canada or the United States being these genocidal settler colonies or a fake country or whatever you want to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, if you go to like a union protest and there's someone waving an American flag, you should go spit in their face and burn the flag or something like that. Like, you can understand that like people are coming from these very complex kind of backgrounds that have been inundated with this kind of propaganda. So it doesn't mean you need to take this kind of stance at all times, and you should be able to talk to people like that. It also doesn't mean you should be wrapping yourself in the flags of these countries and trying to appeal to people through this kind of nationalistic tendency as well, which is just kind of a reactionary viewpoint in and of itself. But this is what these kind of patriotic socialists instruct us to do.
Yeah, and I think they kind of deliberately muddle the waters a little bit when we say that, like, When I say that this movement has a fascist or semi-fascist political character, I'm not talking about the base. The base could be, maybe some of them, are sympathetic to fascism. Maybe some of them are genuinely seeking like an anti-establishment alternative, right? Maybe some of them are like quite, reactionary. Maybe some of them are like looking for allies in the anti-war movement. But a movement's political character is not determined by the individuals within that movement, the base. It's determined by its leadership. And this movement is led by Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Josh Hawley, Matt Gaetz, people like that. And they are, because of them, this movement does have a fascist political character.
Yeah. And I guess part of it seems to me as well, when you talk about, Cuba or Venezuela or even the stuff with Ukraine, a lot of the time the way that like the imperialist aspects of this has maybe been obscured a little bit more, and because it's maybe less visible, it becomes more difficult for people to take a stance. Like the Cuba thing's a good example where, like you point out, there's very real issues in Cuba, economic issues. How much of that is caused by the blockade against Cuba? Well, probably a lot, I would say. But that doesn't mean that people aren't struggling, that people don't have the right to stand up and start asking, demanding that the government try to address their needs. But then at the same time, you have this like very obviously astroturfed like SOS Cuba thing going on, and you have all these politicians kind of weighing in on it. So I think people do need to be like, while sympathetic to people's material needs in these places, whether they're socialist or not, you should also recognize like when there is an operation like this going on and what the goal of that is, and that when you take this kind of like third position on it, you're only really helping that project, and you're not really helping any of the people that are genuinely struggling. But it's the way that this kind of thing is obscured through the NGO complex and the think tank complex. And because the state or the government basically has this degree of separation from some of these accusations or from some of these maneuvers, it allows people to kind of pretend that imperialism is invisible, or they pretend that it's not there. But I do think that's an area where people need to be smarter and recognize when imperialism is causing these things or contributing to them, and being opposed to it. Because I think if you're on the left, if you're an internationalist, that should just be a no-brainer to be opposed to that, like, no matter what the situation is. You see a lot of that with Ukraine as well. And I guess that's the final thing that I wanted to mention, just how the Russia-Ukraine conflict has caused such a big split as well. And how, when it comes to either Russia or places like Iran as well that aren't socialist countries, and being opposed to like arms transfers to Ukraine doesn't mean you support these places or everything that they do. But again, it's something that seems to me should be a no-brainer, which is to support NATO proxy, just to not support NATO proxy armies. When you see NATO funneling money into this or arms into this conflict, like, you have to understand, if you're on the left or anyways, that there's something more going on there, and it's not that NATO got it right this time, or that they're doing so to promote sovereignty or human rights. Like you talked about the last time you were on the show, Amanda, like the way that Ukraine is already being prepped for this kind of like capitalist penetration in the reconstruction period, whenever that's coming. And people need to be smarter about recognizing, when these things are going on. And even though it becomes difficult, and especially when this kind of big media narratives are going on about these things, and it can be a tough viewpoint to take, and it can lead to having criticism or personal consequences or whatever. I think that, to me, is part of like being part of the internationalist movement, or being on the left in the middle of the empire, is just being against these things when it's going on, which unfortunately a lot of people just seem to have kind of not passed the test on over the last year and a half.
Yeah, I think the propaganda around Ukraine has been really sophisticated, right? And I have like a little bit of sympathy for people who, just because of the way that it's been portrayed in the media, people who their gut instinct is to support Ukraine, because the way that it's been portrayed in the media is that it's like this like nation that is fighting for self-determination against this like huge Russian invader. And when presented like that, when it's presented as like some kind of parallel, like akin to Palestine, which I've seen, how could you not support that? But I think, you know, what's like much more complicated is if you look into the history of US and IMF involvement in Ukraine, right? You know, you talk about Ukrainian sovereignty and, you know, them fighting for it in this like in this war against Russia. Well, I mean, Ukraine hasn't had sovereignty and like since the coup in 2014, right? That was like, you know, there was a phone call of Victoria Nuland and like a diplomat to Ukraine, and they were like pretty much planning out who they were going to put in positions of power. But I mean, before that, like ever since, you know, like we talked about it the last time I was here, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the IMF has basically robbed Ukraine of any sort of sovereignty. Like what sovereignty do you have when your country is the third largest borrower of IMF loans? And you know, you were one of the poorest countries to come out of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And, you know, like every few years, you need another IMF loan. And then that's conditional upon, you know, it's conditional upon the government slashing labor laws, eliminating the welfare state even further, eliminating public spending, eliminating pensions even further. So, you know, like how can you talk about sovereignty when you are under the thumb of the IMF like that, and have been for like, you know, almost over 30 years?
Yeah.
So that's what like people don't really take into consideration when they're talking about this war.
I think also we do have to acknowledge that the war is the worst and most deadly conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And there's been like a refugee crisis unlike anything in the history of Europe. And we do have to acknowledge that. And I do think that it really bothers me to think that ultimately what's happening is like, you know, I believe it's a proxy conflict, and ultimately the people who are going to lose the most are ordinary people of Ukraine. And I view that as really unfortunate. And I think we do have to acknowledge that. Something I wasn't on the steering committee and on the international committee at the time when the statement came out. And I wasn't in the international committee then, but I wasn't on the steering committee. The statement went regarding the conflict when it happened. And something I do regret that DSA, but also the socialist movement in the US didn't try to do as soon as it happened, is try to be involved with all the refugees that are coming from Ukraine. I think a lot of those people that were exiting, like vast majority, is just ordinary people. And I think we should, like, regardless of your thoughts on like what happened on the war, I think we should have been helping them. And I think it's, you know, refugees for the most part they're refugees for a reason, in the sense that they are innocent. And so I do think I do have regrets about, in terms of like I still think we should be trying to get involved with that. But of course, like, it's become so politicized that even the mention of that could become concerning.
Yeah.
But I do think that we do have to acknowledge that in terms of what is occurring here. And I don't see. I think the most likeliest outcome is like a frozen conflict. But as we've seen with like Korea, that doesn't mean it's good. Like, it doesn't mean like there's technically the Korean War is still happening. It's just frozen. But
Yeah.
people, like, it's just like, say, the DPRK is just like faced this huge onslaught of sanctions. You know, Russia's a bit different, as we've seen, in terms of like all the sanctions that the West collectively put on it, but still really hasn't like impacted the economy in the way that they thought, because it's just so large and there's so many resources. But I think it's still important to acknowledge that a frozen conflict is not necessarily peace. In fact, it's the continuation of war, but just not through direct conflict.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the way that these sanctions didn't really affect Russia as much, and that goes back to a point you were making before, which is exactly why a lot of these nations, even though they don't have that much in common with how their government is organized when it comes to Iran and Russia and China or Venezuela and all these places, but they are coming together because they recognize that like they need to have this kind of united front to be able to have an answer to this kind of economic warfare of sanctions and stuff like that. So it's not really hard to understand, why that is. And yeah, I guess to your second point, it's absolutely, I think it is important to acknowledge the horrible violence that's gone on and the refugee crisis, which is exactly why I think it's been important to acknowledge the role that the West played in leading up to that conflict and helping to provoke it, which doesn't absolve Russia of any horrible things that Russia's done over the last year and a half. But we should acknowledge the role that the West played in that. And we should work to end the conflict and not continually fan these flames and add gasoline to this fire, which just leads to more violence and more death and more war and more refugees. But unfortunately, that's been the big split, where you have a lot of people that, claim to be kind of part of the left, but who have spent the last year and a half advocating why we need more arms and why we need to support NATO on this. And it's just, for me, it's been kind of a frustrating experience to see this kind of thing just continue to go on for the last year and a half. And really for the last year, I mean, in terms of actual territory there in Ukraine, it's could have ended now a long time ago and had a lot less bloodshed and violence, but people have been cheering it on. And I think that's been a really kind of unfortunate outcome for everyone, but especially for people in Ukraine that actually have to live there.
Yeah, I also want to acknowledge, I saw in the chat people were saying like, oh, well, people did try to reach out to these refugees, or a lot of them, because they were raised in a post-Soviet Ukraine, that they have a negative opinion of socialism or communism. And, I totally buy that. I definitely think that probably most of them don't have a positive opinion on socialism. But, people are coming in with they don't have shelter, they don't have food, they don't have any permanent place to stay. It's like, dude, just because they're anti-social, does that necessarily mean that they shouldn't get that? I think the answer is clearly yes, they do. They deserve to have shelter. And how else are they going to change people's mind if they if we want everyone to have housing, we want everyone to be have the need that they meet, that are met. So how are you going to convince people to want socialism, even if they're against it, if you're just going to deny that? I think we a lot of our work in terms of if in organizing and in trying to create a new world is that you just have to eat shit, man. You just deal with it. It's like, even if someone hates you, but they're not actively trying to defeat you, but they just don't like what you stand for, but they're just an ordinary worker. Guess what? What matters more is you try to get workers together with other workers. That's the most, that there are two classes in society. There's a small minority that is organized, the ruling class, and there's a majority that is unorganized, which is the working class, which we're all part of. So we should try to keep trying to organize the disorganized class that we're part of.
Yeah, for sure. And just to add another point to what you're making, I don't think back to kind of laying the responsibility where it should, go. There is certainly a strong current of anti-communism in Ukraine. But again, the US has its hand in that as well, right? Just through, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they were just pumping NGOs and USAID money into these post-Soviet states like Ukraine, so that they could intentionally shape civil society into accepting more of this bourgeois pro-capitalist ideology. So, even that itself, the particular anti-communist political currents within the country, again, all roads lead to the United States.
As usual. And yeah, and I think that's a good point as well. What we're saying, how the idea of Western imperialism has been kind of obscured by this NGO complex. Or you talked about the Euromaidan as well, which has people gotten tripped up on as well, saying, "Well, no, that's not a coup." In the same way that they said Bolivia wasn't a coup, and they point out the fact that there are these very real democratic movements that are part of that, but then they ignore the role that the West obviously plays in promoting a specific outcome out of that very real kind of like organic movement that comes from there. And that's something that I think people need to be smarter about. Anyway, this has been a great conversation with both Amanda and Jorge. Thank you both for coming on the program. Really appreciate the work that both of you do. Is there a final thought that you want to leave us with? Like Amanda, if you want to promote whatever you're working on, Jorge, if you want to talk about your campaign within DSA, I'll give you the final word here.
Yeah. I guess I would promote the latest article that I wrote, which is on Liberation News. It's called The Resurgence of America First Isolationism. Forget like the subtitle. But yeah, it's about this, this reemerging political current within the Republican Party that I kind of talked a bit about earlier in the show, as embodied by like Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah, so if people could check that out, I would appreciate it and be grateful.
Yeah, I have a few things to promote, if you don't mind. If you're in New York City, and well, first of all, I would say if you're not in an organization, you absolutely should. No organization is perfect. No organizing is perfect. But if you are looking for an organization, I'd recommend you join DSA if you're in the United States. And specifically, if you are in New York City, I recommend you check out this link for events that are happening by NYC DSA, which is a local chapter here in New York City. And I recommend people check out. There's a campaign going on called Union Power, which we're trying to do is create capacity for solidarity, for strike solidarity, but specifically trying to build towards what may or may not be a potential strike led by the Teamsters against UPS. And we want to make sure we're prepared for that, but also other strikes like the WGA strike and other ones that seem to be potentially in the works. And one last one I do want to mention is that there is this petition by the Palestinian Youth Movement, an organization by young Palestinians that are suggesting to free Walid Daqqa. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. And if you are, give me 1 second, if you are in any of these cities, this is not just for people who are in New York City. There will be protests. One tomorrow, July 7th at 4:30 p.m. at UN headquarters. But also, if you live in the UK, if you live in London, there will also be a protest in front of the Israeli embassy at 2 p.m. July 8th. But also, if you live in Canada, that's right, we're on a Canadian stream. So if you live in Canada, there will be a protest in Montreal on July 8th, this Saturday, at 3 p.m. So be sure to check it out.
This Saturday. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it's been fantastic to talk to both of you. You're both welcome back anytime. Always a pleasure. And I'll see you in the China DM.
All right. Thanks for having us on again, Rob.
No, it's my pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.